Welcome everybody to today's event with Peace Medie. We are delighted to host her to talk about her new book, Global Norms and Local Actions, the Campaigns to End Violence Against Women in Africa, and to some extent her broader work, including her very recent novel, His Only Wife, which is published to great acclaim here, and I think as Shirley will say, the world around. My name is Jennifer Cook. I'm director of the Institute for African Studies at George Washington University, housed within the Elliott School of International Affairs. The Institute serves as a hub for activities, debate, research, and discussion on Africa-related issues. And we are delighted to be hosting today with the Global Women's Institute, headed by Mary Ellsberg, whose mission is to advance gender equality through research, education, and action, and with the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs, headed by Shirley Graham, who I'll turn to in a moment to say a few words about that. I'll then introduce Peace, Dr. Medie, and we'll turn to her for her presentation, and we want to save lots of room for questions and answers. So please, if you do have questions, raise your hand. We'll check in on the chat, but we'll want this to be really interactive. I do ask if you can leave on your camera. It makes it a little bit easier for the speaker to speak to faces rather than little black tiles, but it's not obligatory, obviously. Dr. Medie, we're so delighted for you to be here with us today. I'm going to turn over to Shirley, and then we'll introduce you, and then we'll open up the discussion. So welcome, Shirley.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here, and it's especially wonderful to welcome Dr. Peace Medie to our school today for this wonderful presentation. So I'm the director of the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs here at the Elliott School. And I'm joined by my colleague, Ariane Sun, who is also the program assistant for the Gender Equality Initiative. It's often referred to as GIA. And our mission is to obviously work with, educate young professionals who are going to go on to become gender expert practitioners and policy makers. And so we're very excited to be co-sponsoring this event today with the Global Women's Institute. And I see Dr. Mary Ellsberg has just joined us. And obviously with Jennifer Cook and the Africa Institute. So I was just mentioning before we all came online that I had just seen in the Irish Times this morning, I'm based in Ireland at the moment, a wonderful review of Dr. Medie's new book, His Only Wife, her new novel. So obviously many strings to Dr. Medie's bow here. And I know a number of you have, I think, have been reading that novel. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Jennifer, who I think is going to oversee the proceedings. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to keep introductions short because I would like to ask Dr. Medie to say a little bit kind of in her own words about the arc of her career and what led her to this work, the novel and the research. But Dr. Medie is a scholar and writer. She's a senior lecturer in gender and international politics at the University of Bristol. Her research is focused on gender, politics, and conflict in Africa. The book that we're going to discuss today, Global Norms and Local Actions, the Campaigns to End Violence Against Women in Africa, was published in March 2020 by Oxford University Press. And if that wasn't enough, in the same year, just a few months later, she published her debut novel, His Only Wife, which, as I said at the outset, has won accolades from across the globe. It was a New York Times Book Review's Editor's Choice, Time Magazine must-read book, and it's a very moving and compelling story. Dr. Medie is co-editor of African Affairs, which is the top-ranked African Studies journal, and she co-editor of the Oxford Studies in African Politics and International Relations. She has a BA in Geography from the University of Ghana, an MA in International Studies from Ohio University, and a PhD in Public and International Affairs from the University of Pittsburgh. She attended high school in Ho, Liberia. So Dr. Medie, before we turn to your PowerPoint, I wonder if you could say a little bit about, as I said, kind of the body of work and what led you to these issues overall, and then we'll get into the research presentation. So welcome, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you everyone for showing up. It's like 9:30 your time, right?
Yes.
So it's quite early. Thank you for coming. Yeah, so I guess a bit about myself that's not on my bio. I think, so how did I even come to do this PhD and study this topic? So my work on policing and violence against women is something that I started working on in my PhD. But I actually didn't plan on doing a PhD in the beginning. I did my master's in international studies. And I remember finishing the master's and thinking, I still do not know enough. And I finished the master's and felt like I wasn't a specialist in anything, and that I didn't have the tools and knowledge I needed to solve the problems that interested me. I really wanted to, I was born in Liberia, grew up in Liberia, so was very much aware of the conflict. And I wanted kind of to have a career that could make a difference in the lives of people who had been affected by conflict. And I thought, so after the master's, I thought maybe a PhD would help me better and give me the tools that I needed to do this kind of work. So that's how I got to do a PhD and how I ended up specializing in issues of gender and women in Africa. And then of course there's the fiction, but like I tell people, because people know me as an academic, but I tell them that the fiction actually came way before my academic writing. I began writing when I was about 10, and not even because I wanted to become a writer, but because I ran out of books. I was a very prolific reader, and nobody could keep up, including the local library. So when I just got tired of waiting, I would just write my own books for myself. So that's how I got into writing. And I kind of kept it up. When I was doing my master's, I didn't write much, and I didn't even read much fiction, and especially my PhD also, there wasn't enough time to write and read. But as the PhD was coming to an end, I just kind of picked up writing fiction again. And the first book that I started thinking about ended up being His Only Wife, which was published last year. So that's kind of my trajectory, I guess, how I ended up in this space.
Fantastic.
So I have a PowerPoint that kind of summarizes my book. And then I think I will talk briefly about my new project, because I have a new research project, and also talk about how my fiction ties in with my academic writing. And maybe that should take like 20 minutes or so, and then we can hopefully have a discussion after that. So I'm going to figure out how to share my PowerPoint.
Okay. And I do want to welcome Mary Ellsberg, who's just joined us, who leads the Global Women's Institute. So Mary, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Great.
Are you seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes, we are. You might want to put it in presentation mode.
Okay, slideshow. Oh, no. Sorry. Okay.
There you go. Perfect.
Excellent. So my book is Global Norms and Local Action, the campaigns to end violence against women in Africa. And it is a project in which I study how post-conflict states have responded to violence against women, specifically through creating specialized police units to address gender-based violence. Some of them focus only on gender-based violence or on violence against women, while others in some countries deal with gender-based violence more broadly. So that's violence against men and women. Um, and my research question, or the main research question, is what explains the implementation of what I termed the International Women's Justice Norm. And this norm is the establishment of specialized police units, but also police officers' responses to violence against women more broadly. And in this presentation, I talk about sexual violence, but in my book, I speak about physical violence as well. And what I'm trying to understand is, or what I try to understand in the book, is how women's organizations, but also international organizations such as the UN, work with states to create these specialized units and to address violence against women. So what we know is that after conflict, sexual violence doesn't end, physical violence doesn't end. And we also know that most victims do not get justice from the formal criminal justice system. And this is partly because in most places, the criminal justice system has been physically destroyed and people have fled for their safety. But even most people do not get justice from informal mechanisms. So in many places, there are mechanisms like chief courts, for example, but it's research has shown that most people are not even getting justice from these forums as well. I did fieldwork in Cote d'Ivoire and spoke to women who had experienced sexual violence, and a lot of them basically wanted the perpetrator to be prosecuted. I mean, there's this notion in some of the literature that women might want other forms of justice, but I was very surprised when I spoke to women, and they felt very strongly that they wanted rapists to be arrested and to be prosecuted and to serve a sentence for what they had done. But what we know is that it doesn't happen for the majority of people. And it's partly for this reason that local actors, but also international actors, have begun over the last, I would say, decade or even more, talking about specialized mechanisms, um, specialized courts, specialized police stations, specialized prosecution units, with the expectation that these specialized mechanisms are more likely to treat women better, are less likely to re-victimize survivors, and are more likely to ensure that offenders are brought to justice and that they are arrested and prosecuted for their actions. And so I term this so what I argue is that there's the development of what I term an international women's justice norm. And this is a norm that emphasizes arrest and prosecution, partly through the establishment of specialized police units and other specialized mechanisms. So I spoke about specialized courts and specialized prosecutorial units. But the international women's justice norm also emphasizes sensitivity towards victims, and that is not re-victimizing people who have experienced whether it's physical or sexual violence. When I was in Cote d'Ivoire, both Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia, but especially in Cote d'Ivoire, I heard a lot about, or women would complain about how they had experienced or they had been victimized, and they would go to the police station and police would begin questioning them in front of everyone. So they would not be taken to a room where they would have some privacy to speak. And often these were women who had been raped, and they were being asked questions about such a sensitive matter at the front desk. And another practice that I discovered in Cote d'Ivoire was if a woman reported rape, the accused will be invited to the police station, and he would sit across from the woman at a table, and the two of them will be asked to basically to me sounds like debate, to the point that whoever is able to make the strongest argument is somehow seen as the person who's telling the truth. And you can just imagine the trauma of sitting across from one's abuser and being asked to have some kind of an academic debate to prove that one is telling the truth. So these are the kinds of practices that exist that such specialized criminal justice mechanisms are supposed to deal with. And I mean, they started in Latin America. I think the first one was in Brazil, but they exist in various forms all across the globe. And I think one of the most well-known ones, well, I guess is partly fictional, is the Special Victims Unit in the police, the show Law and Order. So that is a form of specialized a criminal justice sector mechanism that's been created to deal with sexual violence. And so they exist in many forms across the globe. And they've been promoted in many instruments and documents, including in Resolution 1325, that really emphasizes responsibility for the responsibility of states to put an end to impunity, to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions. But then even within regional instruments such as SADC's protocol on gender and development, we do have a clear statement asking for the creation of specialized mechanisms for survivors of violence to deal with sexual violence, physical violence, other forms of gender-based violence. And so in my work, I'm trying to understand in the book, how is it that these specialized mechanisms come to be created? Because what we see is that even if states on the book say that they have a specialized mechanism, on the ground, it looks very different. And there's a lot of difference in how states actually create and establish these mechanisms and how they come to address violence. And so my work is trying to explain the differences that we see. Why is it that some countries are going to have offices and personnel assigned to these units while other countries will not? And what does it mean for women's access to justice within these countries? And so the book talks about three things: creation. And my point is that often when states say that they are creating, a lot of time it ends on paper. And so I wanted to separate creation from the actual establishment. And so I sorted it into creation and institutionalization, where institutionalization describes the formalization of the unit beyond a statement or a policy saying that something is going to be done. And then, of course, I look at the third level, which is street level implementation. And so I'm asking, what happens when a woman walks into a police station? How is she treated? And how does the nature, the structure of the specialized units dictate how she's treated by the police? And so for this, in the book, I look at all countries in Africa and how, and the units that they've created when they were created. But the focus in the book is on Liberia and Côte d'Ivoire. And so, like I said earlier, this began as my PhD dissertation. So for the PhD, I only worked on Liberia. And after my PhD, I spent a couple more years doing field work in Côte d'Ivoire. And so the book has these two case studies. And I mean, I selected them partly because of, I guess, this contrast. Liberia has four specialized mechanisms. It has a criminal court E. The criminal court E is a court that deals only with rape cases. It has the Women and Children's Protection section of the police force, which is the focus of my study. It has the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Crimes Unit. This is a separate prosecution unit. And then a Gender-Based Violence Unit, which prosecutes non-sexual forms of violence against women. And then this is in comparison to Côte d'Ivoire, that has two mechanisms: a gender desk, and these were basically desks or individuals within regular police stations who dealt with violence against women, and sometimes with gender-based violence more broadly. I'm sorry. So the focal points rather were the individuals within regular police stations dealing with gender-based violence, whereas the gender desks were these buildings that have been created specifically to deal with the problem. Um, but the difference between Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire was not only about the number of specialized mechanisms, but it was also about how they had been institutionalized. So I found that 3 years after Liberia first created the Women and Children's Protection Section, within 3 years, there was a women's and children's protection section in each county of the country. They had officials assigned exclusively to these units to deal with gender-based violence. So these were police officers, both male and female, whose job it was to only deal with gender-based violence. And within 3 years, Liberia had created a central directorate. So there was a national office overseeing all of the operations of these women and children's protection section in the country. This is in contrast to Cote d'Ivoire, where 4 years after they created the gender desk, they did not have a central directorate. So there was still no central office that was overseeing the operations of gender desks within the country. People were not assigned exclusively to deal with gender-based violence. So I remember speaking to this senior officer, and I said, how is it that even in the gender desks, which are entire buildings devoted to gender-based violence, how is it that officials in this gender desk also are dealing with non-gender-based violence crimes? So they might be investigating rape cases, but they're also investigating theft, for example. And he said, well, we have a lot of crimes in this country. Why should we devote personnel to deal only with gender-based violence? So this is just kind of illustrates the difference in attitudes in both countries towards the problem. And 4 years after the unit had been created, they had not been established in every region of the country. So there were sections of the country, areas within the country that did not have one of these gender desks. And this is unlike Liberia, where every county had one within 3 years. And so my work is trying to understand why you have this difference in how these two countries have approached the issue. And for this work, I did mostly qualitative work, well, only qualitative work. And I think I started fieldwork in 2010 and completed in 2017, I believe, because I did many short visits. I did over 300 interviews with police officers. I spent a lot of time in police stations. I would just go in the morning and sit there and observe them and speak with them over time. I spoke with survivors of violence. I spoke with UN personnel. I spoke with women's rights advocates, activists on the ground. So it was the kind of study in which I tried to understand the behavior of the police, behavior of government officials, but also to speak to the people who were actually interacting with the police and who could actually tell me if what the police were reporting to me was what really happened daily within these police stations. So this is an example of a gender desk in Cote d'Ivoire. I think I took this picture in 2017, I believe. So this was one that had been created, but had been built with funding from the UN. And it's supposed to be one that dealt with violence against women and other vulnerable people. And this is another new, at that time was still a new building that had been put up and had a separate gender desk as well to deal with gender-based violence. So, but all of these were in Abidjan. So this was in the capital where most of the activity was at that time. And I mean, just to summarize my argument here, I argue in the book that if we want to understand the variation, if we want to understand why Liberia established its specialized units, much differently from Cote d'Ivoire, we have to look at the domestic level. I think in some spaces, there's an assumption that with international pressure, you're going to get states to do certain things. And the argument that I make is that with international pressure, you might get states to, on paper, agree to do things. They might sign documents, they might even create policies, they might pass laws. But if you really want to get implementation, you want to get action, you want to get them to, in this case, institutionalize their specialized units. A lot of it depends on domestic actors, strong pressure from domestic actors, in this case, women's organizations, but also the political conditions within the country. So I found that in Cote d'Ivoire, the security sector was very politicized. I mean, Liberia was also politicized, but not to the extent to which it was politicized in Cote d'Ivoire, such that every attempt to reform, to introduce these specialized units was met with a lot of suspicion. In fact, within the gendarmerie, one of the things that they tried to do after the war was to for the first time, have women join the National Gendarmerie. And because of how politicized the security sector was, people within the gendarmerie concluded that it was an attempt to weaken the force, that political actors wanted to weaken the force. And to do that, they were bringing in women who would somehow dilute how effective they were at their job. And so this very politicized nature of the security sector made it much harder for UN officials to push for change within Cote d'Ivoire as opposed to Liberia. So I mean, my work, I contribute to the literature on international norms and specifically on norm implementation, but I also kind of make a contribution to the gender and politics literature. I think the literature has shown that we know that women's movements are very important when it comes to policy adoption and policy creation. And my work shows that they also play a very important role when it comes to implementation. And then another thing that I ask in the book is, what does this mean for the street level? And what does it mean for a woman who walks into a police station, having a specialized unit or not? What difference does it make to women? And what I found was that when you have specialized units that are institutionalized, survivors are more likely to encounter police officers who were trained because specialized units that have made a lot of effort to develop their personnel are more likely to have officers who are trained. And officers who are trained are less likely to re-victimize and are more likely to understand the law and how the law should be enforced. But also, I argue that within specialized units, within institutionalized specialized units, survivors are more likely to encounter police officers who view rape as a crime to be prosecuted. And especially before these units were created, what you had in many places was informal resolutions of rape cases where police officers would decide not to hand over the case to the prosecutor and will maybe fine the perpetrator. However, with the creation of these specialized units and by institutionalizing them, there then are more police officers who view rape as a crime and are less likely to, accept a bribe or to try to play judge and jury in rape cases. And finally, I also talk about the need for a holistic approach to law enforcement. And there's a lot with the international community. There's a lot of emphasis on security sector reform, on the law, and all of that is very important. But my time that I spent in communities talking to survivors really underlined the importance of support beyond the criminal justice sector. Um, so even where the criminal justice sector worked perfectly, and it doesn't in any place, survivors still need assistance beyond that. I talked to people who needed medical care, needed economic support. One of the biggest problems in Cote d'Ivoire was stigmatization, where women, after they had revealed that they had been raped, were shamed, were stigmatized, were ostracized. And I spoke to many women who told me that what they wanted was to be relocated from their communities. They no longer wanted to live there, but they did not have the resources to do that. And so I argue that there's a need for a more holistic approach that addresses these other concerns as well. So that is my work on policing and the post-conflict response to violence against women. Very quickly, I will just talk about what I'm working on now. My new project is, which I'm extremely excited about, partly because it's not as depressing, is a study of women traditional leaders in Africa, and it's a comparative study and it's a collaboration with researchers at the University of Ghana, Pretoria, and Makerere. And it's a study of women traditional leaders in Liberia, in Ghana, in Botswana, and in South Africa. And first of all, we are just trying to understand what the landscape look like. What are the different kinds of women traditional leaders? How have their roles and status and positions changed over time? What do they do in their community? But we're also trying to understand whether it makes a difference to have a woman traditional leader. Do they address problems in a different way? Do they adopt approaches that differ from male traditional leaders? So we look at things as how they deal with violence, how they deal with like financial insecurity, how they deal with accessing public services. And I mean, the findings, so we did preliminary field work in 2019. We're supposed to do field work in 2020, and of course we couldn't. So the project is on hold, but even with our preliminary work, we have just found really, really interesting findings. For example, during the Ebola pandemic, the epidemic, women traditional leaders played such an important role in getting people to follow health guidelines. And unfortunately, this is not spoken about a lot, but they are very important actors in the community. In Liberia, we found that during the war, women traditional leaders actually negotiated with rebels. Women traditional leaders hid people who were going to be killed. And when we talk about like people who contributed to conflict resolution and peace building and violence prevention, you know, they are almost absent from the literature. There's very little work. I think Gretchen is one of the few people, Gretchen Bauer, who's on screen right now, is one of the few people who has done work on women traditional leaders. So there's just so much interesting like information and contributions that they are making, and I'm just really excited to see where this project goes. And this project is very much in line with my interest in kind of shining a light on important actors and communities that are often neglected within scholarship. I mean, as I remember being a kind of a PhD student, and in trying to decide what you want to study, and at least in political science, there's like always the trendy and the sexy topics. And unfortunately, you know, women traditional leaders wasn't like a trendy or a sexy topic to study. And it's the case with a lot of really important issues in Africa. And I think over time, I've just become more comfortable with doing work that I think needs to be done, but that might not necessarily be appreciated as much by the academy or by other scholars, but it's important to kind of emphasize people that are doing really important things. Since the pandemic, we haven't been able to do work, but what we've been doing is trying to really just profile these amazing women. So we started putting their bios onto Wikipedia, because I thought people should know that there are women traditional leaders out there and they do amazing work. And so I guess it's thinking about academia and scholarship in new ways and thinking about innovative ways in which we can make a difference. So we're doing the Wikipedia thing, and then last week we decided to start an Instagram account where we would post pictures and like short historical information on various women traditional leaders. And I think people will learn a lot from that. And of course, it's like not standard, it's not a journal article, but it's just another way in which we can showcase this very important project and these women and the work that they do. So that's kind of what I'm working on now. And now I'll just end very briefly with the book to tie it all together. My fiction really is just me talking about the same things that I talk about in my research, but in a different way. So His Only Wife is it's a book about a young woman who finds herself in an arranged marriage, and she's under pressure from relatives and friends to make this marriage work. And this book really has been greatly influenced by my research. First of all, when I began writing this book, I was writing the global norms and local action. And I remember feeling just very overwhelmed with all this research on violence and wanting to step away from it and spend, because I was just spending all my time thinking about violence, reading, writing about violence. And I wanted to do something different. And so when I started writing this book, I had only one rule, that there will be no physical violence, because I just wanted a break from all of the work on violence that I was doing. But also, at the core of this book is someone who's facing a lot of pressure and has to make very tough decisions. And actually, one way in which my research influenced this was I remember being in Côte d'Ivoire and speaking to women who had experienced intimate partner violence, and they would tell me, oh, I wanted to leave this relationship, but my mother told me to stay, or my friend told me to stay, even though this man was abusive, and so I didn't leave him. And that just really got me thinking about the things that we do as people, as women, because of the pressure that we're facing from the people around us. And so I wanted to write about this, but kind of once again, not through the lens of violence. So partly this is where this book comes from. But I mean, my fiction really just allows me to explore the same issues that I write about, but also that I teach about. When I teach gender, I teach security. And in fact, I've used short stories in my classroom to teach about gender and international affairs, for example. So it's just another format in which I'm able to like approach or deal with issues such as gender inequalities and the power relations between men and women in society, but also to kind of highlight the various ways in which women have tried to and continue to try to uh, chart a path for themselves, and in many ways to defy the various pressures that they face. So yes, this is my novel. I'm currently working on the third novel, which once again is about women in Ghana. I guess that's all I'm going to be writing about for the rest of my career, but we'll see where it goes. Okay, well, thank you all very much. I will stop sharing my screen now. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Oh, what a fabulous presentation. Yeah, just so great. I have so many questions, but I'm going to open up first. I'm not going to hog the floor. I'm going to turn first to my colleague, Liberata Mulamula, who is Associate Director of the Institute for African Studies. She's based in Tanzania. And I'm going to save my questions, but everybody raise your hand if you do have questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, of course, for putting this together. And Peace, you're really a Peace, as you do justice to your name, because this is the first time that I've had a scholar done so much work on this issue of sexual gender-based violence. Thank you for sharing that with us. My question is, I think since you started writing, and I know you have been focusing on Côte d'Ivoire and Liberia, but did you go beyond those two countries to see what is happening in other parts of Africa? For example, in Rwanda, in the region which I am more familiar with, the Great Lakes region, we had a summit of the heads of state, I mean the president sitting together to see how they can address this problem of sexual gender-based violence, which was saying it was not a good image for the region. They call us as the capital city of rape in Kinshasa and all that. So they came up and declared zero tolerance sexual violence. But as you are saying, what is being said, what is being written, is not what is happening. But one best practice, which I think I would just ask you to follow up. In Rwanda, they have what they call one-stop center, where you have all the victims of sexual violence, where they go, where you find the police is there, the representative of the judicial branch, everything is in one. So I really want you to open up and see what is happening in other parts of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that comment. And yes, so I did, even though there are a couple of chapters where I look across Africa at the various units that have been created, but I only did like in-depth field work in Liberia and Côte d'Ivoire, partly because of resource limitations. I couldn't go to many other countries across the continent, but I very much know about the Rwanda one-stop centers. They have been celebrated as a best practice. And yeah, so I know about them, but my hope with my research is that like other people will take it up and go to countries that I wasn't able to go to because I am just limited in how much I'm able to do on the ground. But I'm hoping that since we've started this conversation, we're going to see more research by others in this area.
Okay, thank you. I can facilitate it so that you go and see what is happening. Even we have a regional training center for the sexual gender bias for anyone, the law enforcement, the police, women in Kampala. So there's so much to learn.
Thank you. I will follow up with you.
Okay, please, we'll exchange more on this.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to turn to Mary Ellsberg and I just once again thank the Global Women's Institute for co-hosting this event. So Mary.
Thank you so much. And this was such an exciting presentation. I really appreciate all that you said. And at the Global Women's Institute, we're actually working with IDLO on a comparative study of in 6 different countries on women's access to justice for gender-based violence. And I also am familiar with your comparative work with Nicaragua, where I've done most of my research. And I think some of your conclusions, well, all of them, but I really appreciate, first of all, your emphasis on the women's movement and how key that is to places where these programs are actually working. And that, I think, for Nicaragua for over 20 years was key to the success of the women's police stations, was the fact that they coordinated very closely with women's organizations who also gave additional services, psychosocial counseling. But as I'm sure you're also aware, we've had a really difficult situation in Nicaragua and many other countries with sort of rising authoritarianism and how that has impacted both repression of the women's movement, but also a real rolling back of many of these measures. In Nicaragua a few years ago, the entire system of over 100 women's police stations was eliminated just overnight by the government because they saw they saw the women's movement as a real threat to them. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts, first of all, on the issue of sort of how this tension between the women's movement pushing governments, but also then, for example, with COVID, authoritarian governments are often getting even more power now to push back. And then I had a question about the women traditional leaders, which I think is a really exciting movement. And I love the idea of putting them on Wikipedia. I think that's something that we should be doing a lot more of. But I also, in work that we've done in South Sudan and Melanesia and other places around traditional justice tends to be even more conservative and sort of repressive of women's rights than formal justice systems. So I'm wondering sort of how the traditional women leaders that you are meeting with, do they tend to be different from male leaders? Are they leaders who are also involved in the traditional courts and administering justice for GBV? So I'd love to hear any thoughts you have about those differences. And again, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mary. So Nicaragua, I have a paper on Nicaragua, and I'll admit that my colleague Shannon Drysdale-Walsh is the expert on Nicaragua, but I do know about the case study, and I think, comparing Latin America to Africa, we are not seeing the same kind of, at least at this point in more places, the kind of opposition to women's movement. But what I think is similar is the lack of ownership of these specialized units, right? So whilst rising authoritarianism very much poses a threat to the specialized units and to the women's movement in some countries in Latin America, what I think the challenge that we're seeing within many African countries is just the failure to take ownership. And so these units are established, and even in many Latin American countries, that was the case, established through international support. And within post-conflict states, explicitly the UN on the ground has worked with governments to establish these units. The problem is that people within the units, police officers, continue to see them as like a UN product. And for that reason, you don't have the local buy-in that is needed, the financial investment that is needed. And it's a problem because when you have a reduction in international funding, the units then suffer because there isn't enough domestic support. So anyway, I think that those are the kind of the similarities that one will see across these regions. And yes, and the point about traditional justice is so true. The fact is, so like when I did field work in Côte d'Ivoire, again, within communities in Abidjan, one of the barriers to women accessing justice was chiefs. And chiefs would discourage people from reporting. Chiefs felt like, almost like the police was usurping their power, their authority, that they should be the ones judging these cases and not the police. But then all of the women that I spoke with were not happy. They did not like the fact that like rapists were being fined very little and then being let go. So definitely chiefs can be a problem, but what we're seeing, and we're still in the preliminary phase stage of this project, but what we are seeing, at least in Liberia, what is that women traditional leaders tend to take a tougher stance on violence against women than male leaders, right? And because of that, women are actually more likely, where there are women traditional leaders in the community, women are more likely to go to them than to a man when they experience physical violence, when they experience sexual violence. In some communities in Liberia, we found that women traditional leaders were the ones who negotiated and ensured that men were paying child support. And they would do things like collect food from the men. The men will bring food, rice or whatever to the traditional leader's house. And she would then ensure that the women, the wife and the children, or ex-wife and children, could then get these things. So they were behaving differently in what we've seen so far. And they were more likely to take violence against women very seriously. And when I spoke to all of them, they said, we don't deal with rape cases. The government has informed us that it's a serious matter. We should not even touch it. And so at least they appear, in comparison to men, to some of the male leaders, at least they appear to recognize that it's a serious problem that should be dealt with.
Great, thank you. If I could just intercede to ask one question about, I mean, you have the women's movement. I mean, there's two parts to that. There's a women's activist movement, but then there's the government that can respond or not. And I mean, I wonder how much of a role the leadership of someone like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf had in determining how receptive the government was. Also somebody who was very tied in with the international community. And so, you know, I don't know how you pull that variable out, but it, you know, she may be a product of a place where a women's activist movement is more more vocal. So it's hard to, you know, chicken and egg, but I wonder if you might talk about leadership's role in this and how what's the connection between the activist movement and government change?
Yeah, so good question. And I do devote some time to that, or space to that in the book. And I think what made my analysis a bit easier was that a lot of this started before Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became president. So it was, then we could say, well, it isn't because she's not the cause of the outcome that we're observing. But this is not to say that she wasn't important, because before she came into power, the units had been established, they had been created, and it was being institutionalized across the country. But there are things that she did. And so when I talk about the domestic political situation, she's part of that, and political leaders are part of that variable that I mentioned. She did things like she appointed the first woman Director General of Police.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And this was a woman who also saw gender-based violence as an important problem, a woman who was therefore more willing to work with the UN in addressing the problem. I mean, this is not to say, you know, having a male leader, I mean, maybe a male leader would have felt the same way, but what we saw was that having a female leader heading the police made an important difference. And she also, there were several times where she gave speeches in which she very clearly said that she wanted the women's movement to demand more of her. So in which she said, I want you to demand more. If you know, she would go to meetings and she would say, gender-based violence, sexual violence is a serious problem. I want you to make more demands of me. I want you to tell me what you need. So at least she was receptive. And every step of the way, whenever the UN officials were proposing new ideas and initiatives, the government was always receptive. And I think, especially in the early stages, the ways in which the women's movement was very important was the pressure they put on the government. So after the war, there were several cases of rapes, including children being raped. And there were several marches by the women's movement. And at that time, it was a transitional government. They marched, they presented petitions to the government. They made demands of the UN peacekeeping mission. So this is the way in which very directly the women's movement was pushing the government, the transitional government at that time, pushing the UN to prioritize this problem.
Great, excellent. Thank you. Let's turn to Malcolm and then Brianna.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm can't get my video working, so apologize for that. But thank you for a really interesting talk. I happen to be very interested in policy implementation, and so wanted to dive a little deeper into two aspects of implementation that you might have come across in both countries. And you can, I mean, I often think of implementation as a kind of procedural and chronological chain of steps. And if you look at the front end, I'm interested at the degree to which there was, you know, in effect, a kind of lobbying effort or stakeholder analysis effort in either country to sort of, you know, isolate and identify where there could be resistance, either at the higher levels of government or even, you know, in sort of mid-level officials who would be potentially jealous of losing certain prerogatives or being, you know, told that this is something you have to do on top of all your other work, et cetera. And then at the other end of the spectrum, when you get down to post enactment, which is where most people focus, what I've witnessed a lot in my work is a failure to operationalize what it takes to actually execute the law. And sometimes that's regulations, but then even then those regulations can be, you know, confusing, contradictory, there are gaps. So in both cases, you have to really engage with ground level stakeholders who have to actually execute these things, which goes back to the leadership issue as well that Jennifer just mentioned, you know, both high level leadership and mid-level leadership. But again, at the execution level, there's a training aspect and an operational aspect that sometimes requires people to really spend time, which is difficult, in saying, you know, well, what if this happens and how do we do this? I mean, it's instinctive for organizations to do that to some degree, but often it's one shot, it's very short, and nothing is committed to a kind of instruction or internal guidance, you know, that really makes it operational. So I'm interested in, you know, at the front end, before the policy was pushed through, did you get any sense of why domestic support might have been weak? Because there wasn't really an effort to engage and listen to where there might be opposition. And then second, again, when you get to implementation post enactment, was there adequate sort of operationalization, especially like in Liberia at these local units? Did you get a sense that, yeah, they really had their act together when it came to how to execute things?
Yeah, so thank you for the questions. When it comes to why there was less domestic support in Cote d'Ivoire, it was because, I mean, partly because the women's movement was just not as strong. And so then that's the whole conversation about why is a women's movement strong in one country than the other. But one reason was that the women's movement was not as strong. And as far as I know, the UN that was leading this entire process and pushing for the creation of this unit had not done the kind of analysis that you are talking about as to where will we get support. But I don't think there was even a recognition of the need to bring the women's movement into this process, because as far as I know, in much of the work, in a lot of the planning that was going on, women's movements, women's organizations were not at the table, and were not involved in developing a plan or for how this policy will be implemented. So, and I think like there was a better job of it done in Liberia, partly because from the very beginning, women's organizations were at the table and were therefore more involved in the process. But as far as I know, there wasn't the kind of, detailed analysis, stakeholder analysis of who is going to do what in either country. I don't think, I didn't see anything as well planned as that. And at the stage of implementation, on whether or not there were clear guidelines, etc., for how things should work out, I think that was more the case in Liberia than in Cote d'Ivoire. In that, in Liberia, for example, after the specialized units were created, they actually developed an entire handbook on how police officers should address sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. So at least I saw more of an effort within Liberia to better plan these things and to kind of anticipate some of the problems that would crop up. But as I said, in Cote d'Ivoire, there wasn't even a central directorate. Because in Liberia, the Central Directorate was responsible for things like creating this handbook that police officers and prosecutors were supposed to use. But in the absence of a directorate in Cote d'Ivoire, nothing like this existed. So I guess those are kind of the differences in how implementation occurred in both places. I'm not sure if I got at the question, but
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Great. Brianna.
Hello, how are you? How are you, everyone? Can we all hear me?
Yes.
yes.
So thank you so much, first of all, very interesting. And this question might be super elementary, but can you talk about the difference between the meaning of traditional justice? Like, is there an untraditional justice?
No, that's a great question. Thanks, Brianna. I think when we speak about traditional justice, we are really talking about everything that is not like the formal criminal justice sector, so not under the states and the courts and the police. Anything that is, or any forum in which you have traditional leaders, but even sometimes it's not even traditional leaders. For example, in Liberia, one forum is the family palaver, and it's a form of traditional justice. It's the family palaver, but you don't have a chief. What you have is elders of a family or different families coming together to address a case, and all of that is termed traditional justice. So I think when we think of traditional justice, we are thinking about much of what happens outside of the formal institutions of the state. And even in addition to that, you also now have religious leaders, Christian leaders. In Cote d'Ivoire, I found Christian leaders, Muslim leaders very much involved in adjudicating cases. And this is why your question, I think, is a brilliant one. I'm not even sure if they fall under traditional justice or if there's like an entire category for them.
Interesting. Great question. Thank you, Brianna. Samuel.
Hello. I am a student from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., who's joining in at this call. I had been interested, you talked about your work in Abidjan. I wasn't sure, perhaps I misunderstood. If you had done work outside of major urban centers, do you notice a dramatic difference in how these kinds of cases are handled between urban areas and rural areas? Is the state more or less likely to be involved in one circumstance or the other? Is there a different social opinion? Are women more or less supported in one environment or the other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I did go outside of the capital in Liberia. I was in Bon County, for example, and when I spoke to police officers, what they said was in rural areas, it's actually harder to enforce the law just because the traditional institutions and leaders are much more powerful. So I spoke with police officers in Liberia, for example, who told me that, yeah, in Monrovia, we are told that if there's a rape case, the person has to be prosecuted. But if you are far away, you're in a rural area, sometimes you can't do that. And some of them even admitted to being afraid of the traditional leaders. And for that reason, if a traditional leader came to the police station and said, I want you to hand over a case to me, they would. Whereas if they were in Monrovia or in Abidjan, that wouldn't happen. So there's definitely a difference in how they work within the country, within both countries.
I wonder if you could say, I mean, just in terms of reaching the people that you talk to, I mean, how open were police to talk to you? And how open were survivors of abuse and violence to talk to you? I mean, how do you, I'm just, that process and kind of the difficulty of that.
Yeah, so I was surprised police officers were mostly very open in discussing these matters with me. And I think in the beginning, when you start these interviews, it's always very kind of formal, and then people get comfortable and they start saying more. What I thought was interesting was no one ever admitted to any kind of unethical behavior. They would always say, yes, others do it,
Right.
but I never do it, which is expected. I didn't expect them to say, oh, yes, I accept bribes all the time. I didn't expect anyone to say that, which is why I triangulated and spoke to other people outside of the police. But they were very forthcoming. But I also had very interesting experiences that kind of told me a lot about how they worked. A couple of times in Cote d'Ivoire, I walked into the police station and they did not know I was a researcher, and I got to experience firsthand how people are treated. Once was I went to into the commander's office and I said bonjour, and I didn't say bonjour, monsieur. And he got very upset about it and reprimanded me for like, I don't know how long, 2 minutes. And among other things, told me that my parents had failed to raise me properly, or I would have known to say bonjour, monsieur, and not bonjour. And this was like, I don't know, 2015, I think. So after all of that, I hand him my authorization that says I'm a researcher and he's supposed to support me and help me and answer every question that I have. And he looks at the letter and he's like, Madam, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you're an important person. But of course, so without me interviewing him, I kind of know what happens when a woman walks into that police station. He didn't have to tell me anything else.
Right.
So there's the formal interview, but then there's the things, and this, I mean, I'm sure you've all spoken in like your various classes about reflexivity and positionality, right? This is when you begin to see all of this at play. And so just me being who I am, my physical appearance, the way I look, meant that I was able to access data without even having to speak with anyone. Speaking with survivors, that was also an interesting experience. I remember going into Liberia as a PhD student and unfortunately having very easy access to survivors of violence, which when I look back on was not a good thing. In that I approached an NGO and I said, I would like to speak with people, who experienced violence, and they immediately was like, yes, we are going to set it up for you, and they did. But then I went to Cote d'Ivoire years later, and it was so much more difficult for me to access survivors because the organizations were very protective of them. Some of the counselors would ask that they sat in on interviews because they didn't want the survivors to be re-traumatized. And I thought that is how it's supposed to be done. I shouldn't be able to go into a country and have access to vulnerable people. And I mean, over time, I've even begun to think about whether or not we need to continue doing research in certain places and with certain populations and constantly re-victimizing people and asking people to relive their trauma for our research articles and books or whatever we think is so important that we are doing. So anyway, I think over time I have a lot of thoughts about basically research and ethics. And I think, yeah. So I remember being in Liberia and saying, oh, it's so awesome. I get to talk to people. And years later, I'm like, that was not good. that I could just show up and they would give me people's contact information so that I could contact them. So anyway.
So interesting. Mary, do you have thoughts on that? Is that, not to put you on the spot, but I know
Thoughts on the issue of being able to talk to people?
not kind of the access issue. I just think it's
Yeah.
really
Well,
fascinating.
I've had in general very good access. We haven't accessed survivors through the police stations. That would be one area that I think would be, ethically problematic. We've had, we've done that mostly through women's organizations where they have the opportunity to contact the survivors and get initial consent to be able to talk to us so that we're not just sort of cold calling them. But interestingly, I think, again, it has to do a little bit with the sense of, as authoritarian countries. In Nicaragua 20 years ago, in our first research, we were able to talk to police and everybody was really interested to talk, to share their experiences. And when we went back 20 years later in 2016, we were not even able to talk to a policeman in the smallest area or even get permission from the chief of police or even health workers, because you needed to talk to, it was the vice president, Rosario Murillo, who is the wife of Daniel Ortega, the president, was the only person who could give access to speak to any government official. And the only way I was able to talk to anybody was sort of through personal friendships and contacts, and it was all off the record. So I think to some degree, the issue of access does have to do with sort of the amount of control that governments have over their agencies.
Yeah, interesting. Questions from the floor. Malcolm, you have your hand up, but I can't tell if that's an old one or a new question. Okay, so I'm going to turn to Eric.
Great. Well, thanks so much. That was really, really fascinating.
That was just me forgetting to take it down. Sorry.
No problem. Eric, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so thanks so much. That was really, really fascinating. I'm just curious to hear more about some of the strategies that the women's movement used in Liberia, especially on the street level implementation side, that would have, made their efforts more successful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one strength that they had was they had already made a name for themselves in the work that they did in trying to end the conflict. So there was a statement by the transitional, what's his name? It's escaping. Anyway, the transitional president, the president of the transitional government, he said, these women, everything that they put their hand to is successful. So if they are making demands about addressing sexual violence, we know we have to take it seriously and get behind them. So they already had a name such that when they spoke, people listened and people at the highest level listened to them. But on a more practical level, in the beginning at least, and of course, there are all these political tensions within the women's movements and factions. But at least from what I saw, they worked very closely with the Ministry of Gender. So for example, in this sexual abuse handbook that I spoke about, women's organizations were involved in drafting it. So that was important. Women's organizations and individual activists also participated in training police officers. So in the various gender-based violence trainings that were being organized, some of them participated, they provided training. They were also part of a gender-based violence platform. So what was in place was that if, for example, a woman came to a police station, a woman came to an NGO or a women's organization to report that she had been victimized, they had this special access to the police. So they immediately refer the woman to the police, and they would then coordinate to get her into a shelter. So, and they were supposed to have monthly meetings with the police. And in these meetings, they will report to the police, but it was also a forum in which they were able to monitor the police. And if issues came up, they could address these issues. So these were the various ways in which the women's organizations and the movement as a whole was working to address the problem.
Thank you. Gretchen.
Thank you very much. I have more of a comment, and maybe Peace, you could comment on my comment. And it's a comment in regards to your work, but also your role as an editor at African Affairs. And so I really appreciated in your presentation that you were just talking about Liberia and Ivory Coast, and you kind of made a point of saying that, you know, that's all you can talk about is those two cases. And then when Ambassador Mula Mula asked her question, you know, it revealed that there are so many other ways, perhaps, you know, that these kinds of things are handled across the African continent. So my comment is, I feel like for so many of us scholars, we are always under this kind of tremendous pressure to generalize based on our cases. And I feel like I always want to resist doing that. And I suppose, especially when you work in Africa, right, which has so many different countries and so on and so forth. So, you know, what do you say to that? And I don't know, again, to what extent you might see some of that pressure as an editor at African Affairs, this move to try to get us all to generalize beyond our cases.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I mean, as an editor, my thing is, do you have the evidence to support what you're saying, right? If you're going to make some argument about all of Africa, you had better kind of done your field work on the entire continent in order to make those kinds of like broad generalizations. And in fact, I think the kind of work that we publish, people are more focused on like detailed in-depth case studies. And what we do at the journal is we tell people, what are the implications for other countries? How do you think this is relevant to similar conditions in other places? But I guess the point is that we're not seeing a lot of that work where people are trying to make sweeping generalizations about the continent. I'm sure it's going to other journals, but it's not coming to us, because we are known for not publishing that kind of work. But I think I do understand. I don't know. I think I'm not following political science as closely as I used to, especially when I was a student. And I was like, what is trendy? What are all the cool people doing?
It would be
but
interesting.
I do know that there is definitely pressure out there for that kind of work, and maybe that kind of work is still rewarded. But I'm not seeing a lot of that in the journal, at least.
It would be interesting to have some kind of clearinghouse or mapping exercise where research like yours and research from Rwanda, and you know, if you can kind of map out what the different responses are in different places and the different structures, and anyway, just a thought on that. Since to get at the variety and the diversity of responses on a larger scale. Questions from the floor. Students, don't be shy. Okay, well, I would love to know the Instagram tag or whatever you call it. I'm fairly new to Instagram. so that we can all follow the traditional leaders, women leaders, if you have that available.
And I'm embarrassed to say I need to ask the research assistant, because she just did that, I think, last week. And she promised me that she was going to put up a few pictures by the beginning of next week. So what I will do is when we do have a few, because I don't want you to like follow us and be like, there's nothing on the page. Okay. So maybe in a couple of weeks when we have a few more images and like historical information, I will send you the link to share with your various groups and classes. But yeah, please follow us.
Yeah, brilliant idea.
We're excited about it.
Yeah. Fantastic.
I'd just like to say, Peace, that maybe Jennifer can give us your contact information, but I would just love to stay in touch, particularly around the project that we're doing right now with the impact of social movements, feminist movements on gender-based violence policy and programs. And we're doing it in South Africa. Where is it? South Africa, India, Nicaragua, and among Aboriginal feminist movements in Australia. And we're also looking at women's access to justice in Melanesia, South Sudan, Honduras, and Philippines, Afghanistan, and someplace else I can't think of. But I just think that there's so many parallels in our work, and I'm gonna download your book right now. The novel I already have, but the other one as well. And I would love to stay in touch with you.
No, I mean, I'd love that too. I don't see enough work, especially on policing, the kind of detailed on the ground investigation of policing in research. So I'm just really excited to hear that you're doing this work.
And the thing that you're doing that I think is so important is putting it into context, because there's so many, there's been a lot of sort of feeling like, well, police stations are, you know, some people say that's the solution, is the women's police stations. A lot of feminists push back and say having women police does not necessarily change the way they treat women. And you have, you know, a lot of poor treatment within women's police stations as well. And I've seen that all over, particularly in Melanesia. But I think what you're pointing out is that it's not the station, it's not the police station itself, it's the context in which it comes about, what kind of ownership there is of it, you know, what kind of monitoring and oversight there is. Does the women's movement have real input into how it's being, you know, how it's being implemented? The issue you've mentioned of international support, I think, is so important. So many of these programs come from international pressure, and if there's nothing domestically to sort of uphold it locally, it really just becomes something on paper. So I really think that it's time for us to be looking and comparing through all these different kinds of contexts to understand when are women's police stations actually useful and when are they not so much.
Great.
Yes.
Any last questions from our participants? Okay. Peace, thank you so much. This was really so fascinating, so in-depth. Loved hearing kind of your story and the connections from fiction and to your research. There's just a lot more there. I hope everyone will purchase the novel. We featured it in our newsletter a couple of weeks ago as the recommended read of the week. And we would love to stay in touch with you as you go forward, particularly on the Women's Traditional Leaders Project. I will, if you send me the Instagram, I will share with the group. I'm happy to share contact information with your permission with those that would like it. And again, thanks for taking the time to be with us. We hope one day to meet you in person. If you make it to Washington, please do let us know. We'd love to